Hey everybody, welcome back to Media Law. Today we conclude our look at copyright. And if you transport yourself back to, let's say, 2013, 2014, even early 2015, and you went to a restaurant, maybe for your birthday, your friend's birthday, your mom's birthday, I don't know, and you're at a restaurant and the wait staff, the waiters and waitresses come by your table, they bring you some birthday cake, and they sing a happy birthday song. Chances are, if you can recall, even though that was just, 7 or 8 years ago, they probably didn't sing the traditional happy birthday to you, happy birthday song that we all know that I'm so not going to sing to you right now. But they probably sang some weird made up version of a happy birthday song at that restaurant. And you may have thought that was weird because why would they do that? And it's not because the management of that restaurant staff loves coming up with original birthday songs. It was because until I should say 2015, the happy birthday song was copyright protected. Eventually, in 2015, there is a legal decision, and a federal judge rules that no one owns the traditional Happy Birthday to You song. And so, suddenly, over the past 6 or so years, you've seen that show up a lot more at restaurants, a lot more on television, a lot more on radio and YouTube and those sort of things, because that song is no longer copyright protected. And like we talked about last time in the previous video, there are all sorts of things that can be copyrighted: literary works, dramatic works, dances, choreography, any kind of art, graphic, sculptural works, certainly movies, sound recordings, architecture, and of course, musical works like this one. We also talked last time about how you get a variety of rights as a copyright owner, not only including distribution rights and the rights to do sequels, prequels, spin-offs, remixes, what are called derivative works, but also you get the rights to control public performance. And so a lot of times back prior to this court ruling in 2015, restaurants were scared to sing happy birthday at your table in a public restaurant because that would count technically as a public performance of a song that they did not want to pay performance rights to use when they brought you like some ice cream or a piece of cake as a part of your birthday meal. So even your happy birthday celebrations at your local restaurant have probably been affected by copyright law along the way. And so, as I referred to in the last video, how long does copyright last? While we always expect to have copyright laws in our country, copyright for an individual work does not last forever. And there are a variety of answers to how long does copyright last. But let's talk first about older works. Works created before 1923 are no longer copyright protected if they are published in the US before 1923, and they can be used however you want. So your favorite hit song from 1920, again, I'm being sarcastic, some old silent movies, etc., are in the public domain. Now, the public domain sounds like, a place that would go next to the elephant graveyard in the Lion King. Like, this is, don't go there. This is a place the light doesn't touch. But the public domain is not a location. It's not the elephant graveyard from Lion King. It is instead a term that's used to describe works that are no longer copyright protected. If it came out before 1923, it is yours to use, not just to distribute publicly, but yours to do a derivative work of, yours to do a public performance of, and that sort of thing. And so while we don't have a lot of favorite movies that come to us before 1923, there are not a lot of songs that you love that were written or recorded before 1923. We typically, at least here in the U.S., value a lot of literature published before 1923. So this is a screenshot from Project Gutenberg, which is one of many places you can get free ebook versions of things that are in the public domain. And so you'll see a lot of these still very famous works of literature, of writing. So we have, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol at number one, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Pride and Prejudice, Frankenstein, Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and so on and so on. All sorts of good stuff like Dracula, Anne of Green Gables, Grimm's Fairy Tales, all represented as books that are in the public domain. Meaning, if you want to print these and hand them out, no one's going to sue you. If you want to post your own PDF file of uh, Tom Sawyer on your website, I don't know why you would, but you could do that. No one can sue you for doing that. Also, what that means is all of these works are available to you as a creative artist, to use a 2021 term, as a content creator. You can do your own version of A Tale of Two Cities on YouTube. You can write your own sequel to Pride and Prejudice. We'll come back to that in just a second. If you are stuck about what to do in your comic book and you want Dracula to show up in an issue of your comic book, you can do that. Dracula is in the public domain. And so that's a pretty cool resource. And we see a lot of times adaptations of A Christmas Carol over and over again. We see all sorts of adaptations of Sherlock, including my favorite version, the BBC version of Sherlock. They didn't have to pay adaptation rights to do their updated take of Sherlock on BBC. They did not have to do that with the version that aired, I believe, on CBS. They did not have to pay licensing fees to do the Robert Downey Jr. version of Sherlock Holmes. It's in the public domain. They could use it. There are also other works for one reason or another that are in the public domain that have been published or distributed or broadcast after 1923. For example, the famous zombie movie, the iconic zombie movie, Night of the Living Dead, due to some paperwork errors and the copyright protection symbol not appearing on screen when they changed the title from Night of the Flesh Eaters to the much better title Night of the Living Dead, suddenly Night of the Living Dead, the George Romero classic, is in the public domain. If you want to sell a version of this on DVD, on Blu-ray, you've got a lot of competition. There's about, I think, 20 something different DVDs on Amazon of this movie, but you can also sell your version because nobody owns it. It's in the public domain. Um, I believe a lot of college and high school and even middle schools do Shakespeare productions because Shakespeare, in my humble but surprisingly accurate opinion, is legit, is an amazing author, and though Shakespeare plays the drama truly holds up to this day. That's the main reason everybody's doing Shakespeare, because it's really good. Let's be clear about that. But also, if you're having a struggling community theater, a low budget high school production, well, you can save a few dollars by doing Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth or whatever Shakespeare play that you prefer for free because Shakespeare works certainly came out before 1923. It's in the public domain, so you don't have to pay anybody to do a adaptation of Shakespeare, which is pretty nice. That's why we have so many versions of Romeo and Juliet hitting high school theaters. Also, while the movie version, the famous 1939 Wizard of Oz movie. Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. Judy Garland version of Dorothy. While the movie is still copyrighted, the original books, the Wonderful Wizard of Oz books by L. Frank Baum, those are in the public domain. So a lot of times you will have adaptations of the Wizard of Oz show up on like low budget sci-fi channel movies, but also show up in those same elementary school, middle school, high school productions, because as long as they use um, the book version of Wizard of Oz, which does not have, for example, ruby slippers, they can do that without paying any performance fees. So if you've ever went to a local production of Wizard of Oz and Dorothy had, let's say, silver slippers or diamond slippers, she did not have the movie iconic ruby red slippers, they're avoiding copyright by using the book adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. Speaking of derivative works, as we continue through our PowerPoint today, Pride and Prejudice, the Jane Austen classic, is in the public domain. And what that means is not only can you do your movie version of that or your uh, theatrical play version of that, but you can do your own derivative works of anything in the public domain. This is how Seth Grahame-Smith ends up with a huge hit on his hands as he takes Pride and Prejudice and chooses to do a spin-off, alternate version, whatever you want to call it, where he just adds a bunch of zombies to the Jane Austen novel, and obviously some plot, some dialogue, but using a lot of the original Pride and Prejudice storyline, dialogue, and characters, and he is able to publish Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and is able to find huge success with that novelization. And so you can take a work that's in the public domain, do your own version of it, and your own version of that becomes a copyright protected work. So you can actually benefit from taking something in the public domain and adding value and adding your own artistic interpretation with or without zombies. And we are able to do that thanks to the public domain. In fact, if you missed it, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies even got its own movie version based on the Jane Austen and Seth Grahame-Smith novel, which wouldn't have happened without a good understanding of copyright law and the public domain. The same goes for works of art, sculptures, paintings. Those things can be copyright protected, but whether it's Starry Night or Mona Lisa or whatever classic piece of Renaissance art that you prefer, if you want to sell pencils and pens and memos and coffee mugs and diaries and scrapbooks with the Mona Lisa on them, you can do that. You don't have to track down Van Gogh's estate if you're doing an adaptation of uh, Starry Night as a daily planner. You do not have to track down the descendants of Da Vinci if you're selling the Mona Lisa coffee mug. You can just do that. It's in the public domain. It's yours to use how you see fit. And there are all sorts of articles. This is just one I pulled from Forbes magazine, a little screen cap here, that there are at least 50 Disney movies based on public domain characters. And if you start to think through just the animated classics that Disney has, whether that's Snow White or The Little Mermaid, there are all sorts of Disney movies based on works in the public domain. You could go on, and you could mention Aladdin, or you could mention Cinderella, or uh, a lot of those, especially Disney princess movies, even Tangled, which is based on Rapunzel, which is in the public domain. And there are obviously some benefits of doing this as a creator. One, it kind of gives you a building block, a starting point for storytelling. You don't have to come up with everything. You've got a basic plot, a basic scenario, and you have also some built-in name recognition. So if I don't know if you remember when Tangled came out, but you're probably like, oh, Rapunzel, I've heard of that. I read or seen an adaptation of that before. It's a smart strategy from Disney. In fact, Frozen, which is my kid's favorite Disney movie. I've seen Frozen more than you have, no matter how many times you've seen it. We watched Frozen every Friday here for a long time. But Disney's Frozen is based on Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen, very, very loosely based, but nonetheless based on a work in the public domain. And as a little nod, a little tip of the hat to Hans Christian Andersen, if you've never noticed, that's why we have characters in Frozen that are Hans, Kristoff, Anna, and Sven. Um, it's kind of like Hans Christian Andersen, if you say it just right. So, public domain, it's a nice thing. Beyond that, what about a work that's created more recently? How long does the copyright protection last before that work goes into the public domain? The short answer is it depends, but that's probably not going to help you out on the test. Here's the much longer answer to that question. If it's created before 1978, it is protected for 95 years. So obviously you can do the math and figure out how long before your favorite songs by the Beatles or your favorite sci-fi movie from the 1970s will be no longer copyright protected a long time from now. Works created after 1978, that's you, unless you figured out time travel. Works created after 1978 are protected for the life of the author or creator plus 70 years. This is a nice thing because if you have some kind of untimely death, your life is cut short, or even if it's not cut short, we can think of all sorts of artists, painters, musicians, writers, filmmakers who perhaps had greater success after their death, unfortunately, than they did when they were alive to be celebrated. And that lets their family, their estate, their loved ones benefit from the royalties from the works that they create 70 years after their death. Now, what if it's a collaboration? What if it's more than one person working on a song or a novel or a sculpture or whatever? If it's created by more than one person, it's protected for the life of the last living creator plus 70 years. And so once in a blue moon, you'll see an older artist, content creator, author, songwriter, etc., partner with a kind of a younger collaborator to just kind of extend the copyright protection of that work a little bit longer. And then, especially a lot of what is created today, created for corporations, created for businesses, are what are considered works for hire. If you are signing a contract before it is distributed to the public, we're talking, a major motion picture, that sort of thing, or sometimes even something as simple as a freelance article or a freelance illustration sent to a magazine or a newspaper. That will also count as a work for hire, and those are protected for 95 years after publication. So when I started freelancing in somewhere around 2005 as a freelance writer, those works are copyright protected. Oh, let me do some math here, for about 80 more years, because those were created as works for hire in my case. So works for hire are going to last for 95 magic years. Now the question becomes, why 95 years? Why life of the author plus 70 years? Those are very arbitrary numbers. Those are numbers, in my humble opinion, that are not set in stone numbers that are flexible enough to change. As you have a lot of entertainment companies, your Disney, your Time Warner, and Paramount, and so forth, literally lobbying Congress, perhaps as I speak, to extend copyright protection a little more and a little more and a little more. Because while Disney, for example, still can trademark characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and so forth, um, they want their copyright to last as long as possible. And there are a lot of mixed feelings about that, which I won't get into right now. But a lot of people are very passionate one way or the other about how long copyright should last. But at least as of the time of this recording in 2021, here's how long copyright lasts: 95 years if it's a work for hire, 95 years if it's before 1978. After 1978, it's the life of the author or creator plus a magic 70 years. Before we move on to talk about copyright infringement and deal with some of that fun, the question that usually comes up if I were teaching this class in seat was, well, what if I create something for my employer, if I'm working for a magazine, if I'm working in a newspaper, or I'm working for a comic book publisher or a television studio? Do I own the copyright or does the employer own the copyright? And unless your contract is super special, the employer usually owns the copyright. This is very frustrating, but has been the industry standard since at least the time of the Great Depression. In fact, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two guys in their early 20s, create Superman for DC Comics. And they sign the rights of Superman away for just a couple $100 in the whole scheme of things. And you can imagine how much money Superman has made over the past 80 years in comic books and toys and T-shirts and movies and television shows. But because they signed a standard work for hire contract, they to this day do not own Superman. Their employer does. And this, for better or for worse, is still standard for a lot of companies. I mentioned some of my freelance work earlier. Um, so I published a few articles for USA Today. The contract I signed made it very clear that they own the copyright for my work, not me. I did some freelance video production work for Skybound Entertainment and Robert Kirkman. You probably know Robert Kirkman as the owner and creator of AMC's The Walking Dead and the comic book The Walking Dead. Very cool experience for me, but my contract again made it clear that when I signed that contract for my video production work, they get the rights to it, not me. So unless your contract's very special, unless you get it in writing, if you're working as a freelancer, part-time, full-time, if you're working for somebody else in journalism, in graphic design, in video production and filmmaking, and music, chances are your employer is going to own the copyright. Make sure that you read that contract carefully. Otherwise, you're going to end up in some difficult situations. Now, the question often becomes, is there a way I can bypass copyright law, or maybe in a more serious way, what about for research? What about for commentary? What about for comedy's sake? Are there some ways I can use copyrighted work without getting permission? Um, there is a defense, it is not a right, a defense that is called fair use. And fair use permits limited use of an original creation that has been properly copyrighted and that's not yet in the public domain. So if you've seen SNL parody something, if you've seen Key and Peele, or if you went on YouTube and seen something like Honest Trailers, and you think, how did they get the rights to parody the Smurfs, or parody Batman v Superman, or get the rights to make fun of Jeopardy, or make fun of whatever? They didn't. Fair use will let you bypass copyright law for a few reasons, but that is like I said, it's a defense, it's not a right. So there are four things that the court will look at when you're talking about fair use. If you are reviewing, let's say, a movie, criticism and commentary, and as a part of your YouTube show, or your at the movies show on television, you can quote from that movie, show a small clip from that movie, and do that without getting permission, because that is criticism. If you take a film class at this university or any other university and they show you clips from movies, it makes sense. A history of film class is going to show you movies. A history of music class is going to play music for you. Um, for teaching, you are able to use small portions of copyrighted work without the owner's permission. For scholarship and research, you can do that. Also for parody, which we'll come back to in a little bit. So let's say you want to write a research paper for your senior colloquium project about The Dark Knight Rises. Students have done that before. And they want to quote scenes of dialogue from that movie in their paper. Obviously, they can do that because that is scholarship. That is, whether you want to think of it that way or not, that is research. In the same way, if they want to show a small portion, like let's say, I don't know, a minute or two of that movie to illustrate something in their presentation on a college level, you can certainly do that. That is fair use. You are not profiting from that, you are analyzing that. In the same way, if the college newspaper wants to review the new Venom movie, they can use an image from that movie in the page of the college newspaper because they are reviewing that movie. Parody, like we talked about, is also covered as fair use. So if you've ever seen South Park or The Simpsons or your favorite YouTube comic uh, reference something, do a parody of something, you think, how did they get the permission to do that? They didn't. That also counts as fair use. We'll come back to parody and fair use at the end of this lecture as we talk about Two Live Crew getting in trouble yet again as we go through media law. They're also going to look at the nature of the copyrighted work. They're going to look at, by nature of the copyrighted work, I mean, is it available for sale or not? If it's not for sale, then you obviously are not hurting the sales of that work. More importantly, they're also going to look at the percentage or portion of a work used. You know, there is a lie out there in the world of copyright that you can use up to so many seconds of a song in your podcast or in your YouTube video without getting a copyright flag, a copyright violation. And there's no magic number. It is looking at the percentage of the work used and how important that percentage is to the overall uh, product that you're quoting from or borrowing from. So, for example, if you play 1 minute of a 2 minute song, like Blur's song 2, that's half the song. That's a huge percentage of the work. If you are quoting one paragraph from a 300-page novel, well, unless it's most important part of the novel or the twist ending or something like that, it's a small percentage. You're going to be fine using that. And perhaps this is the biggest one. What they're going to look at also, if you are arguing, what I did was fair use. It wasn't a copyright violation, it was fair use. Um, and this ends up in some kind of civil lawsuit. You're going to look at, can you demonstrate an adverse economic impact from the copy? In other words, can the person that's saying, hey, that's a copyright violation, prove that you have diminished the sales of their work? Um, and so this is perhaps a dated example, but as you, I imagine, know from your U.S. history, President Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, and many years after that pardon happened in 1974, Gerald Ford wrote a book, and as a part of that book, he explained why he chose to pardon Richard Nixon. Well, there was a publication that got in trouble for printing just that excerpt from the book because the book publisher and former President Ford were able to say, hey, that's one of the main reasons why people would buy this book. You can't just release that part for free. That's going to hurt the sales of the book. At the same time, if you use a 10-second clip from a movie in your YouTube review of that movie, it's probably not going to hurt sales or streams or downloads of that movie. So you're going to look at how much is it going to hurt the original version. Gawker, before they got shut down, got in a lot of trouble back in the fall of 2010 because they just put pages and pages and pages of Sarah Palin's book America by Heart on their website before, if memory serves correct, it was even available to purchase, available to be read. Obviously, that could hurt the sales, and so a judge ordered them to take that down because that could certainly hurt sales. They couldn't argue fair use because they were going to hurt sales of the book by putting a lot of pages from it online. And as we transition now to talk about how the court decides whether something is a copyright infringement or not, chances are you can think of several examples of songs that you've heard before that kind of sound like other songs, whether that's Queen and David Bowie's Under Pressure, sounding a whole lot like Vanilla Ice's Ice Ice Baby. But you see, if you read a lot of news, um, frequently songwriters suing other songwriters left and right due to copyright lawsuits. For example, Ed Sheeran, as well as Faith Hill and Tim McGraw, got in some trouble um, because they claim their song, The Rest of Our Life, perhaps was totally ripping off an Australian song called When I Found You. They settled that out of court, as they often do. But if you were to, let's say, Google search copyright lawsuit, you're going to find all sorts of these. Um, Sam Smith, at the height of his popularity with "Stay with Me," um, faced some legal trouble from Tom Petty, one of my favorite artists, because "Stay with Me" is completely different lyrics, but the melody, note for note, pretty much exactly the same as Tom Petty's "Won't Back Down," just a little bit slower. But when this becomes an actual legal battle, which ends up in court, which the Tom Petty Sam Smith case did not, there are three major questions that the court will look at, and we'll break down and talk about each one of these. They're going to look at the validity of the copyright. Is this something that can be copyrighted? They're going to look at the access to what was supposedly stolen, because obviously you have to have heard or seen something if you're going to steal it. And then they're ultimately going to look at substantial similarity. Are these substantially similar or just kind of a little bit similar? So there's all sorts of examples we could talk about. And if we had more time this semester, I would play songs back to back. But Carly Rae Jepsen and Owl City got in trouble for supposedly stealing Good Time. Turns out they didn't. I am not exaggerating when just about everybody tries to sue Drake, even though he started from the bottom. Everybody's suing Drake for copyright violation. In the same way, for one reason or another, everybody tends to go after Kanye and sue Kanye West for copyright infringement. It is the kind of thing that faces, I feel like, the music industry more than any other industry. Um, Even Two Live Crew frontman Luther Campbell tends to sue people for copyright infringement from time to time. At the height of 50 Cent's popularity, Curtis 50 Cent Jackson was sued by Luther Campbell because he claimed his song Birthday was a lot like In the Club, 50's 2003 hit. Uh, but that didn't work out for Luther Campbell in the court of law. And as we've already heard about, thanks to an excellent student presentation, um, Flame and his track Joyful Noise is often compared to Katy Perry's Dark Horse, and there's the ongoing legal battle left and right with judges overruling previous decisions, and this case up for yet appeal again. We'll see what the final verdict continues to be. Uh, as one jury will say, Dark Horse copied Flame's song and will award Flame all the dollars, all the millions of dollars that Katy Perry earned from Dark Horse. And then the court reversed it more recently, and so Katy Perry most recently victorious, and so suddenly she is keeping her Dark Horse money. Copyright is always fun to talk about. So let's go through these three criteria and talk about legally. If you don't settle out of court, what are the questions the court is going to look at to determine if something is indeed a copyright infringement? The first thing they're going to look at is the originality of the plaintiff's work and the validity of copyright. Obviously, your work must be original and substantial and valid. Now, I know we think very differently of Bill Cosby today. Turns out he was a horrible person. But in the 1980s, he had the most popular show on television with The Cosby Show. And there was an executive that used to work at NBC that said, well, I came up with The Cosby Show before Bill Cosby did. And they said, well, do you have a script? Do you have even an outline? Do you have some kind of written version? And he said, no, but I had the idea first. And you're not going to win claiming you had an idea. Um, you have to have something substantial and valid that's copyright protected. If he could have produced a script, that's a different story. Having an idea doesn't really count. If you go to Netflix and you're going through your watch list and you say, oh man, I had an idea for a movie that sounds just like this movie I'm about to watch. Well, unless you have the movie to show someone, or a novelization, or some kind of Word document, or script, or some kind of treatment, it's not going to count. You have to be able to have an original substantial version. You can't copyright an idea. You have to copyright a creative work. And so if there's no work that's been done, it doesn't matter if the song sounds similar to your idea or the TV show sounds similar to an idea you had once. Perhaps the most famous case happens to John Fogerty, frontman of Creedence Clearwater Revival, who had their heyday way before you were born. And one of their biggest hits was a track called Run Through the Jungle, which ironically I would play for you right now if I did not get a YouTube copyright violation. So instead, you'll have to Google it yourself if you're interested in this case. Well, he, after CCR breaks up, goes solo, as a lot of artists do, and releases the album Center Field, which has the opening track, The Old Man Down the Road. And because of some bad blood between the former record label that he used to be on and the current label he was on when he recorded Centerfield and Old Man Down the Road, John Fogerty ends up in a lawsuit where they claim that The Old Man Down the Road sounds too similar to CCR's Run Through the Jungle, even though he wrote them both, even though he played guitar on both songs, even though he sang lead vocals on both songs. He's literally sued in this Fantasy Inc. versus Fogerty case for sounding too much like himself. And so he has to prove that his copyrighted work is indeed valid and original. In fact, this goes to court, and I'm surprised this hasn't been like at least a TV movie yet. I'm surprised like VH1 hasn't made this movie happen or something, where he literally takes his guitar to court, plays Run Through the Jungle, plays Old Man Down the Road, and says, hey, see how they're different? See how I'm playing different chords? See how the melody's kind of different? And if you think of your favorite artist, really from any generation, not just John Fogerty's generation, but some more current artists, I think we tend to like artists that have a signature sound, who can conjure up a certain vibe, a certain feeling, a certain move, and a certain original sound. And that comes with being an artist. So in this case, certainly Fogerty was able to win this case. So the first one's very simple. Is it something you can copyright protect? The second thing they're going to look at is access. Did the defendant have access to the copyrighted work? Again, this is very simple, very straightforward, but you have to be able to prove that someone has heard your song if you claim that they stole your song. You have to prove that someone has access to buy your novel before you say, hey, they ripped my novel off and made hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars. It just makes sense that access should be a part of this. I don't remember the James Bond film off the top of my head. I thought I had it here in my notes. But there was a composer that claimed, I think it was The World Is Not Enough, but don't quote me on that. But one of the James Bond themes was his theme. And he begins the process of filing a lawsuit that they have ripped off his theme music, his score for this James Bond movie. And as it turns out, they asked him if he had ever, submitted it to any agents, if there were any recordings of it online, if the sheet music had been distributed. And he said, no, it's just right here in my home office. No one's ever heard it before. And then he obviously does not win this case against MGM or whoever was distributing the film and their music. Because you've got to have access if it is theft, if it is a copyright infringement. And so Robin Thicke and Pharrell released Blurred Lines to major success about 6 or 7 years ago, and are sued by the estate, the family of R&B icon, the great, the late Marvin Gaye. because blurred lines sounded a whole lot like Gotta Give It Up. And as a result of the lawsuit, Robin Thicke, perhaps not thinking when he's being interviewed, says, "Yeah, we listened to the Marvin Gaye song all the time when we were recording this song. In fact, I said, hey, Pharrell, we should try to come up with a song that sounds a lot like Marvin Gaye's Gotta Get It Up." And that's what became Blurred Lines. And therefore, that really hurt their case. And the Marvin Gaye estate, his family, gets all $7.4 million that Blurred Lines had earned up until that point, and obviously has earned in royalties in the 6 years since this case happened, because you can't say, hey, I want this to sound just like Gotta Give It Up, and then say, oops. Certainly, they had access to the song. Um, just to share a silly example, back when I was in high school, I wrote a lot of really bad short stories. Was really into science fiction at the time. You can make fun of me later. But then in the summer of 1998, I go to the theater and I see Deep Impact, and then a little bit later I see Armageddon. Bruce Willis, Liv Tyler, and of course Ben Affleck there in Armageddon. And at the time, I was like, oh my goodness, what does it mean? Because I had written a short story about 6 months before these movies came out at the age of like, I don't know how old I was, um, 15, I guess, about astronauts who went into outer space to blow up a giant asteroid that was on a collision course with Earth. And then I go to the movies a few months later and I see the same version. Um, and not surprisingly, the makers of Deep Impact, the makers of Armageddon, had not read this really lousy short story that only existed on my mom's laptop computer, so I could have never proven access. As much as I would love to get some of that Armageddon money, access is important. And thanks for letting me share that little story, that little silly story. We'll move on so you judge me a little bit less. Third thing that you're going to look at when you're talking about copyright is substantial similarity, and this is the biggest one. There are obviously lots of similarities between works. A lot of dances have the same basic movements. A lot of stories are about a character who wants something and overcomes obstacles and goes on a journey to get whatever they want. But there must be more than minor similarities between the works. For it to be copyright infringement, there must be what the court considers to be quote unquote substantial similarity. And it is difficult, I think, in a lot of cases to prove things are substantially similar. It is perhaps easy to prove they are kind of in some ways similar. Very difficult in a lot of cases in a court of law to prove substantial similarity. For example, at the height of the Harry Potter craze, back when the books were still new, around the time J.K. Rowling was publishing Deathly Hallows and coming to the end of the Harry Potter series, she was sued by Nancy Stouffer, who published prior to Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone overseas. Nancy Stouffer had published Legend of Ra, and she had re-released that book as the original Muggles, Legend of Ra and the Muggles, and changing her name from Nancy Stouffer to N.K. Stouffer to perhaps make herself seem a little more similar to J.K. Rowling. Well, this goes to court, and she's hoping to get some of those millions or I don't know how much J.K. Rowling got from Harry Potter, perhaps billions of dollars of Harry Potter dollars. So she's hoping to cash in and say, hey, you stole some elements from my book, Legend of Ra in the Muggles. And they ask her the normal questions. And so Legend of Ra is an original novel. It is a work that can be copyright protected. It's not an idea that was just in her head or whispered to a friend. It is a tangible creative expression, so it met that standard. It was available for purchase both in the US and overseas in the UK, so J.K. Rowling could have had access to The Legend of Ra. And so then it really became the question of, are these books substantially similar? And this is where Nancy Stouffer, or perhaps I should call her N.K. Stouffer, since that's what she prefers, um, insert joke here. What are the substantial similarities between these two books? And she says, well, they both have castles. There's a young hero. There's magic. Oh, and there's the word muggles. Now, if you're a Harry Potter fan, or maybe even if you're not, you will know from the Harry Potter series of books that muggles are people that do not use magic, right? You're a wizard, Harry, or not, you're a muggle. And so that's what a muggle means in the Harry Potter universe. Muggles in Legend of Ra, later republished as Legend of Ra and the Muggles, were more kind of mutant, freakish looking creatures. And so even though the word was the same, even what it meant was not the same thing. And as it turned out, long story short, when they republished Legend of Ra, they inserted the word muggles a handful of extra times in the reprinted version of the book in hopes to increase their chances of winning this lawsuit, just like they changed her name from Nancy Stouffer to N.K. Stouffer in hopes of winning this lawsuit. So she does not get any of those J.K. Rowling Harry Potter dollars after all, because these works had a couple small things in common, but were not in any way substantially similar. In fact, um, even though the main character was named Larry Potter, it was proven that she had basically taken the art style from the modern Harry Potter books and even um, changed how the characters looked in her books to make it a little bit more deceptive. And it hurts to win a case when you're being deceptive. All sorts of other examples I could mention. Um, Back in 2012, there was a Joseph Gordon-Levitt movie that you've probably never heard of or seen called Premium Rush. And there was an author named Joe Quirk, that claimed that the upcoming uh, JGL movie was a copyright infringement. He had published a few years earlier The Ultimate Rush, about a rollerblader who gets mixed up with some gangsters and organized crime, kind of an innocent person caught in the middle. And Premium Rush follows Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character as a bike messenger in New York who gets mixed up as a part of his deliveries with gangsters, the mob, and organized crime. And even though there were a lot of similarities between the two, the court felt that even though he was able to prove that this movie studio had access to his book, The Ultimate Rush, Joe Quirk lost this lawsuit because Premium Rush was different enough from his novel. Even though perhaps Premium Rush wouldn't have existed without The Ultimate Rush, the two were not substantially similar, at least not substantially similar in the court's eyes, and so Sony Pictures won out. Speaking of artists that people like to sue left and right, not just Kanye, not just Drake, not just J.K. Rowling, but Taylor Swift is facing all sorts of copyright issues, and we could devote video after video about that, but trust me, there's plenty of them already on YouTube. Um, for example, at the height of 1989's popularity, there was someone else claiming that they wrote Shake It Off, and in particular, this artist this artist blamed her and claimed that he had basically created the line "haters gonna hate," and that's the essence of his song. He also claimed that's the essence of "Shake It Off." And in 2015, as a lot of headline writers and journalists had fun with this, we had headlines like this: Taylor Swift shakes off copyright lawsuit. In fact, even the judge had a lot of fun pinning the official court document about why um, Taylor Swift's Shake It Off was a copyright protected work that ripped off absolutely no one. There's no copyright infringement involved with Shake It Off. Arguing that the Braham character, this guy that sued her for $42 million in damages, didn't have a chance. The Judge Standish, saying in this federal court ruling, at present, the court is not saying that Bram can never, ever, ever get his case back in court, but for now, we've got problems, and the court is not sure Bram can solve them. Going on to write, as currently drafted, the complaint has a blank space, one that requires Bram to do more than write his name. And upon consideration of the court's explanation, Bram may discover that mere bleeding band-aids will not fix the bullet holes in his case. At least for the moment, defendants have shaken off this lawsuit. Good stuff, good stuff. So as we bring our copyright chapter to a close, I want to talk about one of the most important First Amendment cases involving copyright, and especially if you're a fan of comedy in general, if you're a fan of music in general, becomes a very important landmark Supreme Court case revolving around Roy Orbison's hit "Oh Pretty Woman" and the Two Live Crew parody of that song, "Pretty Woman," which they released in 1989 on their album As Clean as They Wanna Be. So for the third or fourth time here in media law, Two Live Crew shows up again. Basically, I'll let you Google the songs and listen to them yourselves, but one thing that Two Live Crew was looking to do in the late 80s was come up with some, what they were freely admitting as filler tracks for their albums. And they decided an easy way to do that was do parodies, do kind of funny variations of songs that people had heard of, because at least the melody was already there. And they decided they wanted to parody Roy Orbison's song "Pretty Woman." Or sorry, his version was actually called "Oh Pretty Woman" and was a huge hit for him a few decades earlier on the pop charts. Well, they decided to do their funny version of the song called "Pretty Woman" and release it in 1989. Which featured not just a verse about Pretty Woman, but also verses about like a big hairy woman, and it's just ridiculous on purpose. Well, as it turns out, uh, they went through the right legal channels to try to get a license and approval from the record company Acuff Rose Music that owned the original Roy Orbison song, but they said no. They denied the request for Luther Campbell and the rest of Two Live Crew to license the song. And Two Live Crew's legal counsel, which by 1989 had already seen their fair share of court battles, says, well, parody is typically covered as fair use, which is a popular defense when it comes to copyright. Well, this actually becomes a very important case, like I already said, going to court in 1992 as Campbell versus Acuff Rose Music, and becomes a Supreme Court case in 1994, with the basic gist of this case revolving around the idea if parody is covered by First Amendment, that was not so much the question, but could it be a commercial parody? In other words, could they profit from parodying someone else's song? Now, at the time, there's certainly a lot of comedy programs on television, SNL, so forth, people that had already profited from doing commercial parodies, but this became a very hot topic and Supreme Court battle. This was also perhaps complicated a little more because around the time Two Live Crew released their song Pretty Woman, and perhaps a bit of marketing genius, this is when the Julia Roberts, Richard Gere movie Pretty Woman comes out, and it's still one of the most financially successful romantic comedies of all time, now a generation later. That song Pretty Woman comes out, and suddenly the Roy Orbison song, which, to be honest, maybe not a lot of people had thought about in many, many years, plays along with the trailer of Julia Roberts' movie Pretty Woman, and suddenly that song is also in the national spotlight, with or without the Two Live Crew version, and it just becomes the biggest deal, becomes a Supreme Court case where they have to decide, is parody truly covered as fair use, as an exemption of copyright infringement, and also, like I said earlier, dealing with this idea of commercial parody. Can Two Live Crew profit from parodying somebody else's song without the original copyright holder's permission? So I put in this week's folder, if you want to watch it, it's very enlightening, but also very amusing. Not often do you see Two Live Crew on C-SPAN, but at the time, C-SPAN, covering all the big events in Washington, D.C., goes to Hollywood, Florida to interview Luther Campbell of Luke Records of Two Live Crew, and they interview him about his parody of the song "Oh Pretty Woman." It's about a 15-minute interview if you want to check it out. Unintentionally amusing, but also, to be fair, enlightening as well. There's also in this week's folder, just from a few years ago, an animated version of this story that VH1 put together, where they actually got Luther Campbell, the frontman of Two Live Crew, to tell kind of his first person version of this story, what happened in his own words of Campbell versus Acuff Rose Music, and then they animated it to some funny animations. For example, this screenshot here claims it felt like he was riding a bald eagle into Washington, D.C. to speak on behalf of all creative artists. It's hilarious, but it's good stuff. And he talks in that video about how the lawyer of Acuff Rose Music basically freaked out and melted on the Supreme Court floor because there were so many legal briefs filed in favor of Acuff Rose Music. Because not only was he defending himself in court by um, championing comedy and parody, but it also would impact the work of artists like Weird Al Yankovic. It would impact a lot of comedy programs like Comedy Central. It would impact what all the sketch comedians were doing on Saturday Night Live. It would impact what the late night comedians were doing with skits and jokes and so forth. So there was actually a lot riding on this case. And if we could trace it back to the four things that we talked about earlier, where the court's deciding, is it fair use or is it a copyright infringement? Again, to remind you, they look at the purpose of the work. Is it for profit or not? They look at the nature of the work. Is it published or unpublished? They look at how much of the work is stolen. Is it a substantial amount or not? And then the effect on the market. Is it going to hurt the sales of the original? So let's break it down kind of as the court did. And so um, they were doing this as parody. But again, the big question of this case was their purpose was also profit. They were selling this as a part of their album. And so were they able to profit from this was one of the big questions. Certainly, they had access to the Roy Orbison version. In fact, on the C-SPAN interview, you'll even see that he has a cassette tape of Roy Orbison's "Oh Pretty Woman." And then the court deals with the substantial similarity, and what they look at is um, are these two works substantially similar? It's not going to sound great, but I can try to pull them up real quick. I'll just try to talk a little bit as I do that. So you've probably heard the Roy Orbison Pretty Woman song before, but it sounds like this. Hopefully I won't get a copyright violation for that. But they are looking at, are these songs kind of the same or are they substantially similar? Did Two Live Crew take the heart of the work of the original version? So you probably know the Roy Orbison song. Have heard it at some point in your life. Pretty woman walking down the street, pretty woman. And what they decided as they heard the Two Live Crew version of Pretty Woman is that indeed it was substantially similar. But then there was a kind of a court discussion of, well, if it's a parody, don't you have to steal the heart of the work in general? To recognize the song that you are parodying, they have to be similar enough that you recognize them. So they decided that was not perhaps as important as to whether or not the work was transformative or not. And so here's just a few seconds worth of the Two Live Crew version. So is this transformative or not, is the question. And so what they decided as a part of this, again, this is a Supreme Court decision, as it, is that the work was substantially similar on purpose, but they added a lot of, there's record scratching, the vocals are totally different, that it was very much a hip hop song. Also, emphasizing that this was intended to be comedic in a way that the Roy Orbison song was never intended to be funny. Don't forget your bald-headed friend. Hey, pretty woman, let the boys jump in. So, by adding hip hop elements, by adding comedy, they were able to say, well, this is transformative. So we don't have to worry about if they're substantially similar. And ultimately, what ends up helping Two Live Crew out a lot is this fourth criteria that they emphasized as a part of this case was the effect on the market or the value of the copyrighted work. In other words, would the sales of the Two Live Crew version of the song hurt the sales of the Roy Orbison version of the song? And as a part of this Supreme Court discussion, it was, I think, very much correctly pointed out that the audience for a Two Live Crew silly version of Pretty Woman, a parody of Pretty Woman, is a very different audience than the Roy Orbison song. That the two audiences are distinctly different. That kind of a classic rock pop audience in the early 90s was very different than a hip hop audience interested in parodies in the early 90s. So because the two audiences were deemed different, and because no one's going to say, I don't know which version to buy, I guess I'll just buy the Two Live Crew version, that you know which version of this song you want to listen to, you know which version of the song you wanted to buy, that Two Live Crew was in no way hurting the sales of the original, perhaps even boosting the sales of the original. It wasn't affecting Roy Orbison's sales or his record label sales at all. And so if it wasn't hurting anything, then we've got to champion parity. And so Luther Campbell, Two Live Crew, uh, gets to be as nasty as they want to be yet again, winning another important case. In this case, Luther Campbell winning in Luther versus A Cup Rose music. And this is very important for parodies in general. So, in fact, Two Live Crew proves victorious. And in all seriousness, as the VH1 YouTube video I linked to emphasizes so clearly, this is really a champion moment for all of comedy, for everybody that does a parody on YouTube, for any kind of internet comedy, for Dave Chappelle, for Comedy Central, for Weird Al, for Saturday Night Live, for Key and Peele, um, for anybody doing comedy. This is a huge moment that says not just is parody important, but parody is an art form that artists can do and artists can profit from, and that we should reward the creative work of people doing comedy, people doing parody, just like we reward anyone else involved in creating art, whether that's songs or storytelling or whatever. So a huge victory for all content creators comes to us because of Campbell versus A Cup Rose music and Luther Campbell in general. In fact, as the video concludes, as this says, on March 7th, 1994, rap won in the U.S. Supreme Court. From that day forward, parody would be protected as a fair use. It was a victory for every writer, comedian, musician, artist, and filmmaker in America. And with that being said, I want to just thank you for listening to this video. It's been quite a lengthy video. We're at over an hour. So if you made it this far, thank you especially for sticking with me and for being a part of this class all semester. I wish you nothing but the best. And if I can help you, please let me know. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks again, everybody.